Following D-Day in June 1944, the fight was on to liberate France from the evils of the Third Reich. Fighting alongside the Allies was the French resistance, and they would have a key role in freeing France from its occupation. But in the aftermath of these regions being freed, the French resistance went on the offensive, and they rounded up many men and women who were suspected of being collaborators or who were suspected of having helped their enemies. Because of this, many people were rounded up and were executed in what was known as a Wild Purge, as they were dragged out to the side of a building and were shot ruthlessly. It was quick and rough vengeance reprisal, and with this thousands of people were brought out to see what was happening too, so the executions were very public. In this documentary, we look at 5 examples of executions that took place at the hands of the French resistance. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. In the build-up to D-Day, the British and Allied nations were planting spies inside of France to work with the French resistance. They would play a key role in the Normandy landings, disrupting and delaying the Germans, who would make their way to the north of France following the landings. But the French resistance were known to have been a brutal foe for the Nazis, and they were a feared enemy. If members of the resistance were discovered, they were usually executed quickly and swiftly by the Germans, with very little questions asked. Some were sent to concentration camps where they were then killed by the conditions there. They did play a key role in the rapid advance for the Allies through France following D-Day. There had been activity inside of France for many years, even as soon as the Germans occupied the country. There were many hardline policies taken by the Nazis against the resistance, and different elements such as the Maquis went to live and take up arms in the mountains and forests. These men were difficult for the Germans to hunt down, and 1944 in particular was a key year for the resistance. But one man who was a member of the French resistance was Edmond Reviel. He was a man who had lived with a secret for decades, and at a meeting of the National Veterans Association in 2019, he stood on his feet and spoke to the other veterans about a mass execution of German soldiers that he had witnessed and been a part of. It was said that when he spoke, it was like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, and the mayor said, over the years he had plenty of opportunities to tell the story and never did, but he was the last witness. It was a burden to him. He knew that if he did not speak out, then no one would ever know. What this elderly Frenchman was talking about was the executions of around 40 German soldiers that had taken place at the hands of the French resistance. Following D-Day on the 6th of June 1944, resistance fighters had staged a small uprising in Tulle, the capital of the Corrèze department, and during this between 50 and 60 German soldiers were taken prisoner by the resistance fighters. 3 days after D-Day, the Germans fought back. They then publicly hanged and executed 99 of their own hostages. In the days following D-Day, more horror would occur as the Germans would discover the charred remains of Helmut Kämpfer, an SS commander who had been locked inside of a field ambulance, and this had been set on fire. Following this, the SS Das Reich Division massacred 643 people inside the village of Orada-sur-Glane. Women and children were locked in the church, which was then set on fire, and men were locked in the barn and were shot by machine gun fire, before the barn was then torched. The village became a ghost town, and it still stands today as a memorial, but Edmond Reviel had taken part in the Tulle uprising, and then he joined a party of resistance members that went towards the east. He said, none of the resistance groups wanted anything to do with the prisoners they had taken. We didn't know what to do with them. So these men accompanied the German prisoners they had captured, and then took them to Meymac. Some of the prisoners had become separated from the main group, and it was said, if a prisoner wanted to take a pee, he needed to be guarded by 2 of us. We hadn't planned anything for food. We were under the orders of an Allied command centre, and they were the ones who gave us the order to kill them. Edmond Reviel is today the last surviving member of the local resistance group of the FTP, and he would then personally witness the executions of up to 40 German soldiers at a place referred to as liberate. Amongst the inmates and the prisoners were other members of the Wehrmacht, but also other collaborators, including a French woman who had collaborated with the Gestapo. But after receiving the order to kill them, the resistance members did not want to shoot her, and they drew straws and the loser had to shoot her. The commander of this group who was guarding the soldiers was codenamed Hannibal, and it was said he cried like a kid when he got the order, but there was discipline in the resistance. He asked for volunteers to carry out the order. Every fighter had someone to kill, but there were some of us, and I was one of them, recounted Reveille, who would not take part. Reveille then told what happened with the executions. In the countryside, he said, it was a terribly hot day. We made them dig their own graves. They were killed and we poured quicklime on them. I remember it smelled of blood. We never spoke again. For over 75 years this secret would remain close with the witness, and it's clear that it must have played on his mind, that if he didn't get it off his chest, then it would have gone with him to the grave. The rest of the executioners who massacred the dozens of soldiers had died, but this would not be the end of the story. It was believed that in the 1960s, a group of archaeologists uncovered the remains of 11 German bodies from Liberate. But then the excavations came to a close, and there were no records stating the exact place of the dig. This was done in complete secrecy, and a local man remembered seeing the excavations and discoveries, and he has now collaborated with modern archaeologists today. This is because in the next few weeks the German War Graves Commission are going to be searching for the remains of the missing German soldiers who were executed. The 98-year-old resistance member's testimony has also been used to try and pinpoint where these people's remains are. There has been a lot of discussion in the media regarding the search for the remains of the executed German soldiers and collaborators. The thought by Reveille, the 98-year-old man, is that he wants these dead soldiers to be remembered and for their stories to be told to the families, so that a memorial can be placed near to the spot. But there are many other atrocities and war crimes that were committed by the French resistance, but also there are war crimes that have been committed by German soldiers. Many of these still today have not been uncovered, and the victims remain in their graves under the ground. Still around Europe there are huge mass graves of victims who were executed by the Einsatzgruppen, or were killed inside of the concentration camps. Many of these people have been exhumed and laid to rest inside a proper burial site. There are also some unknown German soldiers who had even been buried inside of Britain, who died in prisoner of war camps here. But whether the 40 German soldiers who were executed at Liberate can be found, or have been found, is yet to be known. It's believed that 11 were exhumed, but that leaves around 30 to be discovered. But the testimony of a 98-year-old man has brought the executions of the Second World War into the forefront of the world's mind and consciousness, decades on from the end of the deadliest conflict in history. Violette Maurice was born in April 1893, and she was a daughter of a retired French Army cavalry captain. During her teenage years she spent a lot of time inside of a convent, and she would then in August 1914 marry Edouard Joseph Goddard, but the couple would divorce 9 years later. But as the First World War was gripping the continent, Violette Maurice decided to have an involvement in the conflict, and she would learn how to drive at this time, and she would then during the war drive ambulances at some of the deadliest battlefields. She would during the Battle of the Somme and the Battle of Verdun serve as a courier of information near to the front lines, and she was considered rather skilled at this. But Maurice was a keen sportswoman, and she would play football for the French women's national team, and she won gold medals at the Women's Olympiads. But as well as being a skilled footballer, she was also a national water polo player, and she was also a pioneering boxer, and she would fight against many men, and often at times beat them. Also she was involved in wrestling, weightlifting, diving, archery, motorcycle and bike racing, and even underwent surgery to allow her to fit in race cars more easily. She would compete in the Tour de France automobile, and in many other races including endurance ones, but her lifestyle was very different to traditional women at the time. She dressed in men's clothes, swore often, was a very heavy drinker, and because of this the French Women's Sports Federation would refuse to renew her licence, and she would be barred from taking part in the 1928 Summer Olympics. She had also at some point punched a referee during a football match, but her racing licence would also be revoked, and she would then try to sue these authorities and bodies. At her trial she stated that, "We live in a country made rotten by money and scandal, ruled by speechifiers, schemers and cowards. This country of little people is not worthy of its elders, not worthy of survival. Some day its decay will bring it to the level of a slave, but if I'm still here, I won't be one of those slaves. Believe me, it's not my temperament." However, in January 1933, Violette Morris moved to a houseboat with her partner Yvonne de Bray, and they were then moored on the River Seine in northwest Paris. They lived off the inheritance that they received, and also sung and began to gain popularity, as they would perform sometimes on the radio. But on Christmas Eve 1937, whilst they were having dinner with their neighbours at a restaurant in Neuilly, Violette came across an aggressive drunk man named Joseph Lecam. She tried to calm the man, but the man then the next day arrived at their houseboat, and an argument broke out between Lecam and Violette Morris. He pulled a knife and threatened her, but Morris pushed him, and then he lunged at her with the knife, and she then pulled out a revolver and shot Lecam twice. He later died in hospital, and because of this Violette was then charged with murder and was held in prison before her trial, but she was acquitted on the basis of self-defence. But then something surprising would occur. Her reputation as an iconic female sportswoman would be overshadowed, and she would become involved and ingratiated with one of the most evil regimes the world has ever seen. In December 1935, she met Gertrude Hanecker, who was an ex-racer but also a German journalist. She was a recruiting officer and agent for the SD, the Nazi security service, and she invited Violette Morris to attend the 1936 Summer Olympics in Berlin, and she would then become an esteemed guest of Adolf Hitler. But this then began a number of years in which Violette would collaborate and willingly pass over information about the French military that she could get her hands on. Some information that she passed on to the Nazis was invaluable, including partial plans for the Maginot Line, which were passed to the German army, as well as maps of strategic points inside of the city of Paris. She even gave over diagrams and schematic blueprints for the French tank the Saumur S-35. The information regarding the plans of the French defences would be invaluable during the German invasion of France during the Second World War, but it's not known what led to this seemingly iconic French woman to become in the pockets of the Nazis. As the Second World War broke out, she would continue to collaborate with the Nazis and would continue to betray her nation. She became a member of the Karlingi for collecting the money that the French had to pay to the Germans to buy goods to France on behalf of the German state. But what this was a French division of the Gestapo, who could at times arrest and torture people, and they were supported by the Vichy government. Propped up by the Nazis, Violette Morris lived very well on her barge, and she would then during the occupation of France take on a number of different roles for the Nazis and the Germans. One of her objectives was to help foil members of the Special Operations Executive, a British spy organisation that would help collaborate and link up with the French resistance. It's believed that Violette, during this, would have been involved in the torture of the suspects, and many of these were women. She would have conducted barbaric torture interventions, where she would beat and whip the prisoners, as well as batter them senseless, and she became, allegedly, a complete brute. Violette Morris was also involved in sourcing black market petrol and gas for the Nazis, and she would run a garage for the German Air Force, also to conduct maintenance and fill up their aircraft. She also drove key Nazi and French officials, and she would have done this in the lead up to the fall of France also. Some historians have debated her role in the spying and torturing, and others class her as a scapegoat, but her reputation became rather well known across Paris and France, and she was referred to as a notorious hyena of the Gestapo. The work that Violette was conducting was directly contributing to the arrests and suffering of many French civilians, and she continued to work for the Germans and the Nazis, and continued to be a rather active collaborator. But because of her reputation, she then became a target for the French resistance, who once they were gaining a foothold across the nation, began to attack. The resistance at times wasn't the best coordinated, but they would try to take out those who were considered helpers for the Nazi regime. After years of occupation, and after years of suffering, they decided to take out Violette Morris. On the 26th of April 1944, she was driving her Citroën traction Avant along a country road from Leuilly to Epagens in Normandy. Inside the car were members of the Balieu family, who had also benefited from the Nazi regime. However, she didn't realise that the car she was driving had in fact been messed around with by members of the French resistance, who had planned to ambush her. As Violette Morris's car came to a spluttering halt on a country road, members of the French resistance stepped out from hiding places, and they opened up their machine guns and weapons onto the car. The vehicle was littered in bullets, and inside the car 3 adults and 2 children were all killed. There were accusations that Morris was the intended target, but inside the vehicle the resistance had taken out a number of collaborators, but also, tragically, some children. Violette Morris's body was literally riddled with bullets and was then taken from the car to a local morgue. Her body went unclaimed, and she was then buried inside of an unmarked grave. Many historians have debated her involvement inside of Nazi-occupied France, and some have doubted the scale of her collaboration. It's believed that she did, a few months before her death, tell the Gestapo about a resistance network involved in parachuting people into the country, and they would also sabotage machinery. The Gestapo would then shoot these 6 people, including the wife of one of the resistors. Another informing session led to the Germans capturing an arms store which was being built up, with 7 resistance members then being killed, and 10 more were sent to the prisons of Paris for torture. But others have claimed the resistance made her a scapegoat. But Violette Morris's career as a celebrated and skilled athlete of the 1920s was overshadowed by her involvement with the Nazi regime, which brought a significant amount of shame to her legacy. But she would meet a brutal and bloody end alongside others who were suspected of collaborating with the Nazis, with her body and car riddled in bullets. What is interesting, though, is why Hitler invited her specifically to attend the Olympics. He may have seen Violette as someone who could be used to gain information, which is what she did. She was a woman who had a sketchy past involving murder, but she was someone who suffered financially during the 1930s. The schmoozing by the Nazis, for her, may have been what ingratiated her into helping them during the Second World War, but information she passed over would be key for the invasion of France. Helmuth Kämpfer was born in Thuringen, in Germany in 1909, and he had a normal upbringing and trained to become an apprentice topographer. It was not the most interesting job for a young man, but then when Hitler seized power inside of Germany, Kämpfer then sought more from his country, and he wanted to find other work. He took up arms, becoming part of the German Heer, who were the land forces of the German army. This was forced in 1935, and it brought back the German army, air force and navy that had been banned for some time following the end of the First World War. The Treaty of Versailles had placed severe restrictions on the German military, but it was clear that Hitler was now building up his army for a significant event across Europe, and many would have seen that he was preparing for a world war in the continent, the second within 25 years. At the time, only the Reichswehr was allowed, and this was a small defensive force comprising of 100,000 soldiers, but Hitler wanted a huge army. He began to enrol all boys into the Hitler Youth, and these were trained as soldiers, and would in the Second World War play an important role in the end of the conflict, when things got desperate for Hitler. The Heer became later known as the Wehrmacht, and the land forces during the Second World War would be involved in huge invasions of countries such as Poland, France, and towards the east in the Balkan states, before they invaded the Soviet Union during Operation Barbarossa. Helmuth Kämpfer then continued to be promoted within the army, and he was then, in 1939, transferred to become a member of the SS, the army's unit of the SS. He would continue to rise throughout various promotions in the Waffen-SS, and he was there on the Eastern Front in the thick of many different battles. He commanded the 3rd Battalion of the Das Reichsdivision Reconnaissance Group of the 4th Panzer Grenadiers der Führer Regiment. He was considered by military generals as a skilled leader and a very brave soldier, and he was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. He was given this for his actions during the cold winter of 1943 in the Soviet Union, and he was also given the Close Combat clasp in gold, one of only a few hundred to receive this. He could have gone higher and become a general. However, things were going wrong for the Germans during Operation Barbarossa. The campaign initially had many successes, as the army rampaged across the land, and they would then be followed by the Einsatzgruppen, who massacred thousands of civilians. But following the Battle of Stalingrad, the war was turning against the Germans, with the loss of the 6th Army. In spring 1944, the Das Reich Division had been sent to the Western Front from the Eastern Front, and Kämpfer went with his division. The Germans knew there would be some form of landing that would take place in Europe, and they knew that the Allies were beginning to consider an invasion of France to try and retake large amounts of Europe. Whole units of soldiers were removed from the Eastern Front and were sent to northern France, where Hitler believed was most likely for an Allied invasion to take place. He would be right in this thinking when D-Day was launched on the 6th of June 1944, but Helmuth Kämpfer had been given a number of roles by the military's high command to carry out with his soldiers. In the southern uplands in central France, he was asked to carry out attacks on the Maquis, a group of guerrilla fighters of the French resistance who were the constant thorn in the side of the Germans. The Maquis were mostly working-class young men who avoided conscription, and they went to the mountains and the woods and created resistance factions. They also organised themselves well, and most of them were in the mountains of Brittany and in the south of France, and they would use guerrilla tactics to disrupt the Germans. They were involved in helping Jews and Allied airmen escape the Germans, and they could spot their enemy, who they were looking for them, from their high positions. They did manage to intimidate their enemy, but they didn't fight in large-scale battles, and they spread their soldiers out in different areas. They would use whatever weapons they could get their hands on, including weapons like the Sten sent from Britain. They did help the Allied invasion of Normandy, and they helped to delay German forces in the north of France, and Kempfer's men would be held up. Kempfer had been sent to deal with these soldiers, with his men, but it did not go very well. Following D-Day, Kempfer was taken prisoner 4 kilometres east of St. Leonard in Oblat by a group of resistance fighters led by Jean Canu. He would never have expected what would have happened to him, and his treatment was incredibly barbaric. Canu then handed Kempfer over to Colonel Georges Guingorgin, a French communist militant who was senior in the Maquis. He was then held within the group, and it was Guingorgin's men who carried out Kempfer's execution. Helmut Kempfer was the highest-ranking officer to be ever captured by the French resistance, and when he was captured, the German soldiers and his detachment of men were sent to go and rescue him, as they realised he had been abducted by the enemy and was in grave danger. But the resistance had no plans to ransom him, or even allow him to return to the Germans, and they planned a huge public execution of a man who they deemed to have been a war criminal. The resistance decided that Helmut Kempfer was to be burned alive on the 10th of June 1944, 4 days after D-Day. A huge search was launched for him, and the Germans shot dead 2 resistance members near to where he had disappeared, and they realised that the Germans would fight back with a vengeance to try and recapture Kempfer. He was taken by the resistance to a village north of Oradour-sur-Glane, and a huge crowd had been rallied and gathered by the resistance. He was paraded in front of the crowd, and the execution of a high-ranking SS man was cheered by them. Many would have expected him to be shot by a firing squad, but this was not an execution that the crowd would forget. It's believed that Kempfer, along with a number of other captured soldiers, were thrown into the back of a captured German field ambulance, which had been left abandoned nearby. These men were all locked inside of the ambulance, and then a member of the resistance then set this on fire, and the soldiers and Kempfer were trying desperately to get out, but they could not. Of course, with this, Helmut Kempfer was killed being burned alive, and then after his execution his remains were taken to Oradour-sur-Glane, and when they got there they would be discovered by the Nazis. SS Sturmbannführer Adolf Diekmann discovered the remains of his former friend Kempfer, and he found the body handcuffed inside of the German field ambulance, along with the other German soldiers near to the village. After seeing this brutality, he then ordered the village nearby to be razed to the ground, and every civilian who was inside the village was ordered to be killed. The SS began to shoot anyone they came across, and the men were taken to 6 barns and a shed, and the women were then locked into a church with the children. The village was then heavily looted, and the men in the barn were then machine-gunned in the legs and were unable to walk. Their barn was set on fire, with 190 Frenchmen dying in this specific attack. The same horrors would occur inside the church, as the women and children inside were locked in. The SS then placed an incendiary bomb next to the church, and when it went off, the church went up in flames. Anyone who tried to escape by jumping through the windows was shot by the SS. In this one attack, 247 women and 205 children died in the church, and there was only 1 survivor. For the execution of Helmut Kempfer, 643 civilians were slaughtered. Helmut Kempfer was the most senior member of the SS to have been captured and executed by the French resistance during the Second World War. The commander and a friend of Kempfer's, who had carried out the massacre and reprisals, was charged over the killing, but all charges against him were dropped when he himself was killed fighting in Normandy. The episode regarding Kempfer's execution and the reprisals were brutal and horrific, but he was a man whose men had been involved in war crimes himself. He was a very decorated soldier, and was one who could have been made a general as the war went on, but locked inside of a German field ambulance, he would meet the brutal wrath of the French resistance, who would deal with Kempfer in a harrowing manner. In November 2003, The bodies of 17 German soldiers were dug up and discovered in a village in southwestern France. The village of Saint-Julien-de-Crempes held a dark secret under its soil for roughly 60 years, as the bodies of a number of soldiers who were executed remained. Émile Gouet, a Frenchman, had on the 24th of August 1944 taken part in the capture of an 82-man German battalion, and the head of his resistance group and battalion promised the prisoners that they were to be taken away and would be treated as prisoners of war and would be processed in the right way according to this. These men were coerced into surrendering by this promise, however it would not be adhered to. In the weeks before, French resistance fighters had killed a number of German soldiers in a battle around a French village in the Dordogne region. In retaliation for this, the Germans ordered brutal and barbaric reprisals themselves, and they ordered all the males from a village who were between the age of 18 and 80 to be gathered. 17 men were collected by the German soldiers, and they were then executed ruthlessly for the deaths of the Germans at the hands of the French resistance. The Germans tended to deal with this sort of thing ruthlessly, as in certain countries for the life of a German soldier, they would execute and slaughter roughly 100 civilians in reprisal for the death of one German. It was said regarding these executions that the women of the village saw the men lined up, leaving in the direction of the hamlet of Malvenay, very close to the town. Along the way, Joseph Murat apparently understood the fate that the Germans had in store for them. He tried to flee, but the Germans immediately shot him down. Arriving in the hamlet, the men were separated into two groups, 5 young people to the right, the others to the left. Men dig their graves, then the weapons click. But the following month later, on the 9th of September, the resistance fighters took their revenge, and of the 82 German soldiers they had taken prisoner and incarcerated inside of Bergerac prison, they removed 17 of them from their cells. These German soldiers were then taken to a field near Saint-Julien-de-Crempes, ready for their executions. They were ordered in front of an execution squad made up of resistance fighters, and these men one by one were executed by gunshot. The German soldiers were then buried in a 30-foot by 6-foot grave. One young boy who was 11 at the time, André Parvot, accompanied a priest who had been summoned to bless the German soldiers' burials, and he was a choir boy at the time, and he claimed that, when the villagers were all questioned, all of the mayors, one after another, said they did not know in the years after the war where the German soldiers were buried on their territory. The village of Saint-Julien-de-Crempes kept the secret about the executions of the German soldiers to themselves for roughly 60 years, but one man, Émile Gouet, who was mentioned earlier, could not keep quiet and live with what he saw. He was, as mentioned, someone who had helped in the capture, and he heard that the German soldiers were to be treated as prisoners of war. He later claimed about the execution that it was a very shocking affair. Unarmed men were gunned down. My commander had given his word. He had told them they would be treated like prisoners of war. He was uneasy decades after about the execution, and he knew it was a war crime, and he spoke with the other witness, André Parvot. No one was willing to speak out about the execution though, and many of those who had lived at the time had obviously died, but in 2003 the bodies of the 17 German soldiers who were executed were exhumed and discovered on the outskirts of the village. After much investigation and with consulting the witnesses, officials dug and broke the ground in some fields on the outskirts of the village, and it took just 6 hours to find the remains of those and to exhume them. Officials carefully removed the bodies and the remains, and a ceremony took place where a local priest blessed each set of the remains. The bodies were then taken away, and some of these even had their identifying dog tags on them, showing exactly who these people were who were executed, and it's not known if families were contacted, but if they were, this would have brought some form of answer to the fate of their loved ones during the war. The meadow where the men were buried became a site of a major war crime, and the bodies were then taken elsewhere, and they were then on the 16th of November 2003 buried inside of a military cemetery off the Atlantic coast containing the remains of a number of other German soldiers. Further research has concluded that these executed soldiers were communications soldiers of the Wehrmacht, who had been captured earlier as mentioned. The men were then buried in the German military cemetery in Bernul on the National Day of Mourning in Germany. However, there was some opposition to the exhumations and also reburials. Some believe that the story of the men should have been left in the past, and others claimed they were shot in reprisal for the slaughterous actions of the German enemy, who had inflicted a huge degree of suffering onto the French people. It was also said that the exhumations placed more emphasis on the fate of those German soldiers rather than the suffering inside of the village during World War II, and that the discovery overshadowed the crimes of the German army. One villager did not agree with the exhumation, and whilst the bodies were being dug up, he turned around and refused to witness it, and he said to a reporter, "What has been buried for so many years, we must not remove it." Some people believe that the exhumations of the German soldiers overshadowed the story of those men, such as André Hamel, who was one of the Frenchmen executed for the attack upon the German army. He was shot at 4 p.m. after he was rounded up on the 9th of August 1944 and was posthumously given the Resistance Medal. What is true is that the executions and reprisals such as those carried out by the Germans and also the French resistance were too common during the Second World War. There are hundreds if not thousands of soldiers whose stories still remain under the ground, waiting to be told 80 years after the war. The exhumation of the 17 German soldiers brought global eyes to the stories of those men who were executed in reprisal for the German shooting of the French villagers. The French resistance were known for their ruthless actions, and they executed many prisoners of war who they captured in retaliation for the German occupation that many people suffered under. They were also cutthroat with their treatment of women, as they forced them to undergo the ugly carnival, as they had their heads shaved in public humiliation ordeals, and they were also covered in Nazi symbols. There will be more executions of German prisoners of war that are yet to be uncovered inside of France, and many of those who witnessed the crimes and executions took what they saw with them to the grave, and they never told their stories. This was the case in the past few years, as a search was launched based off the statements of a very elderly man who witnessed an execution of soldiers, and he wanted to tell others what he had seen. Still today these specific burials of the men have not been located. Today the 17 German POWs who were executed are later rest inside of a German military cemetery. The French milice, or the militia, was created on the 30th of January 1943 as a response to fight against the French resistance. The milice first supported the Vichy government in unoccupied France, however it was later in support of the Nazi government in Paris. It's believed that at its height around 35,000 men were in the militia. The French resistance as the war was progressing was getting more and more successful, and they were seen as more powerful, and the milice was gathered to fight against them. Pierre Laval was the Prime Minister of Vichy France at the time, and he was their formal head. However, the man who was really in power and held power inside of the group was Secretary General and de facto leader Joseph Darnard. It was a group that appealed to men from many different backgrounds. Some believed that the militia was right to repel the resistance, and others were supporters of the Nazis and preferred life during the occupation. France had been defeated by the Nazis, but there were many French people who were sympathetic to Hitler's cause, and some Frenchmen were allowed to join the SS at some point. Others who joined the milice were men who had been unemployed, and the group offered paid employment, good pay, and also substantial food rations which were better than what the French population were receiving. Also, members of the group were exempt from being forced to conduct hard labour in Nazi Germany, where they would suffer a much worse fate, and that's why some joined. Others had been part of the pre-war far right in the country, and others joined as their families had been injured or killed in Allied bombing raids, or had faced threats from the Allies. Criminals were recruited as they were told they would have their sentences reduced if they joined, and most of the members gave a few hours a week to take part in milice activities, but there was a full-time section of members, known as the Frank Garda, who would live in barracks. But as mentioned, their main job was to find out about the French resistance and also fight them. Members of the milice would work with locals and friends to find out what was happening, but they had a superior advantage over the Nazis and German soldiers, as they had excellent local knowledge, and this could make them a fierce opponent of the French resistance. They were given a relatively free rein to do what they wanted, and they would often round up suspects, and they were allowed to torture people. These ordeals were brutal, as the militiamen would beat and brutalise men and women accused of being in the resistance, and they would also arrest the family members of those accused. After obtaining confessions, they would also carry out executions by firing squads, or hand prisoners over to the Germans, so they could be dealt with by them. But the French resistance deemed the milice as more dangerous than the SS and the Gestapo, as their knowledge of the local areas and the fact they had more informants made them very deadly. But the torture and execution that the milice got involved in quickly led to a war between them and the French resistance. The resistance would target members of the group for assassination at public places such as in cafes or in the open, and on the 24th of April 1943 they shot a milician in Marseille. Over the next few months, dozens have been killed and wounded in attacks, but the most prominent person killed by the resistance was Philippe Henriot, often referred to as the French Goebbels. He was killed inside of his apartment in the Ministry of Information in the early hours of the 28th of June 1944 by resistance members dressed as members of the milice. His wife was spared, but the milice would then retaliate by killing a number of anti-Nazi politicians and local leaders. They would work inside of different zones, and they established their headquarters in the old headquarters of the Communist Party. But they would be involved in further anti-partisan operations, including a battle of Glider, as they tried to suppress the resistance near the Swiss border, but they could not do so, and the Germans had to then be brought in to help them. The milice also executed 34 prisoners inside of a Paris prison after a revolt broke out, but as the Second World War was coming to an end, a number of the militiamen realised what they were involved in could come back to haunt them as the Allies took control. Marshal Philippe Pétain began to try and distance himself from the milice and their torture, and also their antics. But after the Allies liberated France, a number of collaborators began to try and flee and hide out. After the German retreat, many milicians were executed either on their own or in mass executions. The offices of the group were ransacked, and agents were beaten and were thrown from the office windows into the streets, or they were thrown into the river, and they were then later taken to prison if they survived. The French forces of the interior, on the 24th of August 1944, would execute 76 members of the group, and some members later formed a new SS detachment known as the Waffen Grenadier Brigade of the SS Charlemagne. This later became known as the Charlemagne Division of the SS, and it had over 7,000 men at its disposal, with 2,500 of them coming from members of the milice. But there were a number of other executions that took place, featuring members of the milice. One eyewitness said, "One afternoon recently in Grenoble, I saw 6 young men shot by the Maquis. All had borne arms against France. Each one was tied to steel stakes. 3 died well." These men had been tied to stakes before they were shot by resistance members, having been declared traitors against France. Another execution of a milice member was said, "For the second time this month, a French mob reversed the decision of a purge court and lynched an alleged traitor. In Dijon, the end of the war trial of Jacques Lossac, former police chief charged with the abuse of French resistance fighters during the occupation. An angry mob led by resistance veterans marched on the city jail, broke the prison doors and pulled Lossac from his cell. They carried him to the city's outskirts and hanged him from a signpost, then dragged his rope-tied body back into the town." Another execution of the members of the milice was said that 6 young men were tied to rusty steel stakes and shot by a platoon of Maquis. They were tried in the morning by a civilian judge and 2 military assistant judges in a shabby palace of justice in the town. They were defended by the town's 2 best lawyers, and they were duly found guilty of treason. At the appointed hour, they were walked out to the spot where a few weeks before 23 Maquis were shot by the French militia on Nazi orders. 3 died well, which is to say they died at once. 3 did not. They sagged on their stakes, and one even stood erect, shaking his head from side to side, as if uncomprehending. He and 2 others received final pistol bullets to their heads. There was a crowd of 5,000 that had come to see the spectacle, and there was laughter and shouting and pushing and noise. There were men, women, children and women with infants in their arms. They cheered when at last a volley came from the Maquis rifles. The milice were seen as a serious threat to the French resistance, and their expert local knowledge made them more feared than German soldiers. But following the liberation of France, there were many executions of them that took place, and they were seen as people in the pockets of the Nazis. Many were disgusted at their acts, as they were considered the worst traitors, preferring to support the Nazi regime rather than act against it. But they were torturers and executioners themselves, and still in recent years there have been members of the group, decades after the war, who have been brought to trial.